Professor Sumler-Edmond is a professor of history at Huston-Tillotson, and I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, Huston-Tillotson University in Austin, Texas. It was indicated earlier that she taught at Clark Atlanta University, so we're glad to see you, come back to Atlanta and spend some time with us. One of the interesting things about Janice is that she spent a year as a judicial fellow at the Supreme Court of the United States in Washington, D.C., and she's also worked as an associate with the Atlanta law firm of Mack and McLean in the areas of labor, employment, and school law. And that's where Maynard and Janice would meet in the elevators at the Equitable Building. Janice is the co-author of two other books, Black Women's History at the Intersection of Knowledge and Power. What a title. And Freedom's Odyssey, African American History Essays from Phylon. I am delighted to welcome you to the Herndon home, Professor Sumler-Edmond.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Herndon home for the invitation.
I am especially delighted that we're going to be talking about this book today because it just seems so appropriate as we celebrate the pioneers in Atlanta, who were pioneers in the African American communities. And as we sit here in the Herndon home, where one of the biggest, if not the biggest entrepreneur that Atlanta has ever seen, and I thought about how much Alonzo Herndon and really Aspasia Mirault really had in common. They, in many ways, were very similar. They invested in real estate. They helped other blacks in their family and in the community. They used relationships that they had between whites to help them get what they needed. And I just thought to myself, well, this is just right at home for you to talk about this free woman of color. So why don't we do that? But before we actually talk about Aspasia herself, give us a little bit of a history about free blacks in Georgia, especially in Savannah, where this book is based. Tell us what it was like back in the antebellum era.
To tell you the truth, I don't think that we know enough about the free people of color. We know a great deal about slaves, and we've done a great job. There are many, many books on the peculiar institution of slavery, but we need to focus more, I think, on the free people of color because they were so important. If we look at them nationwide, they were about 10% of the black population during the antebellum period. They provided the leadership. They were the link between the enslaved population and the white population. But at the same time, they were not, this society was designed for two groups, enslaved blacks and free whites. So now we have a middle group. We have people who are free, but they're black. So they were seen by many sectors of the population as a threat. How are we going to keep the slave population down? We can't allow them to see free people of color roaming around, doing their own thing, having businesses, buying real estate. So they were marginalized and considered really a pariah group in society.
The blacks were very interesting in Savannah at that time, too. There were quite a few demarcations, if you will, based on either where they were born or based on what their religion was. Talk about that a little bit, if you don't mind.
Savannah it was an amazing place during the antebellum period before the Civil War. And as you mentioned, there were many different groups within the black community. But what was so great about it is that these groups came together as a melting pot. And they formed one black community, pretty much, a unified black community. You have the folks from who were immigrants from the Caribbean, Haiti, and other islands, like Aspasia.
And these people never knew slavery. So the people from the islands like Santo Domingo, for instance, which is where Aspasia came from.
No, they were, she was part of a mulatto family and had close ties with the planter class in Santo Domingo. So they don't know slavery as victims of slavery, but they might know slavery as being part of the slave-holding group. But in addition to coming into Savannah, in addition to the immigrant blacks, you had, of course, the enslaved blacks here, and you had free blacks. And they all came together in one community in Savannah.
So when you say free, you mean ex-slaves who now had their freedom?
There were some folks that were free from.
Oh, in
the
addition
beginning.
to those who
Yes,
were free by birth?
Yes.
Okay. I found interesting that for instance, the Catholics would be integrated in their churches. Baptists would be very segregated. Why the difference between the two, I wonder?
It's amazing. I'm not really sure, except that the St. John the Baptist Catholic Church in Savannah welcomed everyone, either free blacks, enslaved blacks, and they have marvelous records. Their sacramental registry shows the births, the baptisms, the funerals, the marriages of all the people. And they'll be very specific. They'll say a free person of color married another free person of color. So for the historian doing the research, you have the information. You know, oh, this was a black wedding versus a white funeral versus a baptism that was mixed.
Now let's talk a little bit about 1818 before and after. 1818 was a special year, and tell us why.
1818 was a very special year. The Georgia legislature, they were just kind of hell-bent on making sure that they had control over the entire black population. Not only the enslaved blacks, but the free blacks as well. So they passed quite a few laws that would restrict the free black population. And one section said that free blacks could not purchase any land, nor could they own slaves. And this was to be a blanket prohibition across the state.
Before 1818, it was possible to own property, to own slaves among blacks, or by blacks, right?
Exactly. Free blacks, if they worked hard like everyone else, which they in fact did, they could own property. They could advance through purchasing other black people. But this law, passed by the lawmakers, prohibited them from doing so.
I wonder how much of that had to do with the fact that so many of these free blacks were from the Caribbean, where they did not know slavery, and like in Haiti, where you had the uprising of Toussaint Louverture, right?
Yes.
So, and I guess many whites were afraid that we would start having revolts among, the free blacks. They're going to bring this enslaved blacks along with them and
very much, and
rise up
and upset the enslaved situation here in this country.
Right.
In fact, there were protests by whites, not only in Savannah but in Charleston, saying we don't mind the whites from Haiti coming in, the refugees, but we don't want the free Negroes coming, because they were afraid that they would begin some revolutions here in this country. And the main thing was to maintain slavery in this nation.
Now, how was it, and let's now start talking about let's now start talking about Aspasia. All right. Give us a little bit of background. I mentioned she was from Santo Domingo, but what kind of mindset did that give her? And how is it that she was able to acquire land after 1818 when they said that blacks could not own property?
Well, she was, as far as I can tell from the record, she was a young child or even a baby in 1800 when the rest of her family came over. They brought her over in 1800. And they settled into this society in Savannah. Her two brothers were tailors, and they did well. They had a partnership, Francis and Peter. They did well, and Aspasia became a seamstress and was part of a very thriving black community. Being tailors, that was a very good profession. They also had butchers and shoemakers and ministers, so a thriving black community. Her brothers, the older brothers, did not have property, but they did own slaves. According to the tax records, I've seen that they did own a couple of slaves. But Aspasia went from being a seamstress with her brothers to a pastry chef. She had a talent, a skill for baking bread, and ice cream was also a part of her bakery shop. And so she accumulated a little bit of money, and she decided, I would like to buy some land. But unfortunately, that 1818 law is going to prohibit her from purchasing the land. So she's forced to think, well, what am I going to do? I have the money. I want to buy some land. I want to create a legacy for my children, a place for them. And so she has to create some kind of scheme in order to purchase the land, because she can't do it outright. So she has to create a secret trust agreement with someone else.
Let's talk about that someone else. Who was he? And I'm kind of word struck because the relationship as described is very suspect, if you will. I mean, this is a young white man, 22 years or more, her junior.
Yes.
Okay, come on, tell us about it.
An odd couple. We have a matronly free woman of color, a skilled baker, and we have a young white gentleman from the north, actually. And so they're both in Savannah, and all of a sudden we see them creating an agreement, a secret trust. And years later, there was speculation that, was there something going on, some hanky-panky going on? I don't think so. I think that they were very, very good friends, because Aspasia was old enough to be his mom, really. But she had a young daughter who was very close in age to George Calley, the white gentleman. So I suspect that if there was a relationship, it was between the daughter and the young gentleman, because they were just very close in age.
Now, let's back up a little bit. You mentioned that the daughter was almost the age of Calley. Whose daughter was this? Was this Samuel Myrant's daughter?
Yes.
Okay, now Samuel Myrant, tell us who he is and what happened to him.
Well, he's kind of lost in history, unfortunately. I found his name in something called the Registry of the Free People of Color. I talked about how the lawmakers in Georgia wanted to keep tabs and restrict the progress of free blacks. In 1818, they said, you must, if you are a free black, you must register once a year. You have to pay money and register in the court. And they would create a list of the free blacks, and then they would post the list in the newspaper and asking all the white citizens, so-and-so says that he's a free black. Is he, or is he your slave? That was the motivation behind that. Well, in one of those lists, for historians, the list is great. It's a great list. So as looking through the list, I saw this name of Samuel Mirault right next to Aspasia, Mirault. Same age, registered together, and I said, oh my goodness, this must be her husband. He only registered once. And then in later years, I would see, under Aspasia, I would see the two daughters with the last name Mirault. So I just kind of put the family together. These are her children. And also, the one time that he registered, they would check him off in subsequent years. And then about 1831, they said, he's dead.
Now, Samuel died, and she meaning Aspasia, then moved on, her children by Samuel, growing up and so forth. And then she meets James Oliver, who's a married man, yet she bears him 3 sons. Was this type of relationship uncommon in that time, or rather?
It happened. It happened. There were other instances of that. She was his mistress.
When it was just well known? I mean, was it accepted? It was just a given, or what?
Not a given, because I don't see the kids listed for a baptismal in the church.
Oh.
So I don't think she just openly went to her church to say, oh, these are my children, but they were there. And years later, the children will admit, James was my dad, Aspasia was my mother. So
And they took his
they
last
took
name.
his last name.
Okay, so let's go back to George Calley now, who basically betrayed Aspasia. How did he do this, and what was the result of that?
Well, it's a very strange situation. He did agree to buy a piece of land, a wonderful lot in Savannah, but he took Aspasia's money, went down, since the law said you cannot, free blacks can't buy land. He took her money, went to the auction, and purchased a lot. His name, he will be the legal title owner. But through the years, he's very honest. He says, I'm legal title owner, but I don't own it. It's really, I own it in trust for Aspasia and her heirs. He said that over and over again, over about a decade. Then Aspasia will pass away, and also the daughter will pass away. But still he will keep his ties with the remaining children, and they move into other parts of Savannah. He will rent out the property. But something happens later on, and all of a sudden he begins to think, it's not Aspasia's property, it's my property. He doesn't pay his taxes in a timely fashion, and it comes to a point in the 1870s that he's about to lose the property. If you don't pay your taxes, things happen. And he tries to get it straight. I paid. And the people say, no, you didn't pay. They go back and forth, back and forth. And he's very stubborn. He said, I paid. They say, you didn't pay. So the officials have the power to auction the property off for non-payment of taxes. So in essence, he, due to his stubbornness and his decision to claim the property as his own, he loses the property. And the children are they're so perplexed about it.
Well, where are the children before now, though? I mean,
They are in Savannah.
Why do they let it go this long?
That is the problem. And I think that's the lesson, one of the lessons that we learn. You never sit on your rights. When they file a lawsuit in order to get the property back after he's lost it through the auction, they say, oh, we trusted him. Okay, great, trust is fine. But after the Civil War, when you have now your rights, you have citizenship rights, that's when you march into court and you make the title correct. You correct the title so that what you knew was the truth before a trust agreement had occurred, you make it, you document it in writing.
Something else also is taking place at that time. The Republicans, who were historically the good guys back then, there started to be a shift during Reconstruction. Talk about that for a moment, especially the government in Georgia in 1878. And some of the things that they did.
Yes, well, what you're referring to, of course, is a Reconstruction. During the Civil War, with the election of Abraham Lincoln, who was a Republican. You'll see the Republicans in power through the Civil War and the period right after, which we call Reconstruction. And usually throughout the nation that would last until about 1878 or 79. unfortunately, in Georgia, at least for the blacks, that period did not last when the good guys were in power. Did not last that long, and as early as the early 1870s, the Democrats are able to get back into power, and they are not as liberal. They are
The Democrats.
The Democrats are not as liberal and are opposed to blacks voting, to blacks having the rights that they had just acquired. We're going to see the beginning of Jim Crow and the KKK. Things of that nature are going to occur.
And a lot of this was really indigenous to Georgia and not necessarily some of the other, or most of the other states. Am I correct that Georgia was especially hard and difficult in terms of restricting rights?
The research that I have found and uncovered does say that Georgia was early, ahead of some of the other neighboring former Confederate states in getting what they call a redeemer or democratic government, or the Democratic Party coming into power earlier.
What does that mean, redeemer? Because I saw that Democrat redeemers. What is
Redeeming, coming back to the way it had been before.
Oh, so the Democrats coming back to the South to redeem it back to what it was before the war?
Yes, before the war.
Interesting. Okay.
And under that kind of atmosphere, we see Aspasia's relatives entering the legal arena, because at this point in the 1876, they want to try and get their land back. And they realize that the way that they're going to have to do it is go to court.
So what happens? They go to court, and the final outcome of the litigation is that first time that they're...
First time around, they have a trial, a jury trial, before 12 white jurors, and the jurors decide in favor of the Mirault family. They believe the witnesses that, in fact, Callie used Aspasia's money and bought the land, but in trust for her and her relatives. So they award the property back to the heirs, as of course Aspasia had intended it to be.
Right. But
So
then,
that was a great victory.
It was, except that it wasn't over then, because in the interim, the city had done what?
Well, the city will appeal. They will appeal to the Georgia Supreme Court. The losing parties will appeal and take the victory of the family and appeal it to the highest court in the state.
To the
Supreme Court of Georgia.
And their ruling on that appeal was?
They will decide against the family.
Is this 3 white Supreme Court
Yes.
justices only?
Our Supreme Court had 3 white justices at the time, and they will go back to the 1818 law. The jury just disregarded it. They said, the facts are the facts. It was Aspasia's money, it's Aspasia's land.
But also, even though that 1818 law was passed saying that blacks could not own property, in 1819 it was rescinded, was it not? Or
yes, it was. Yes, it was. But for most of the state, except for Augusta and Savannah and Darien.
That's right.
So those were. So when she bought the land in 1842, she was violating the law.
The 1818 law.
She was violating the 1818 law. And that's what the justices of the Supreme Court will use to take the property from the heirs, from the family, and give it to the folks who bought it at the auction in 1872.
You talked a little bit about how this litigation could have been avoided. What really should have been some early steps that might have precluded or might have prevented this whole thing from going to litigation?
Well,
should we not trust?
Not illegal trust, anyway. No. We can't put our trust in trust. what she did, Aspasia did what she had to do. She had to kind of circumvent the law for the time, but her children should have, for one, stayed on the land. They stayed she built a home, mm-hmm. and they should have stayed there instead of continuing to trust someone to collect rent and that kind of thing. And then after the Civil War, the second thing they should have done, as I mentioned, they should have gone to court and after the Civil War and formalized what Aspasia had done informally and illegally in 1842.
Well, obviously the heirs were not quite as astute as Aspasia was when it came to business management. And what was it about her business skills that made her successful in a time when it would have been very easy to fail?
She was a great businesswoman, and she just had wonderful customer skills. There's a wonderful memoir that I include a little bit of it. A gentleman, a white doctor, years later from Savannah, who wrote about his childhood growing up in Savannah. He mentions her, and he mentions going to her bakery shop, loving her ice cream, and he remembered her vividly, and he said she was a tall mulatto woman, and the children even had a nickname for her. They called her Spazy.
Spazy.
And the way he describes her, it's a kind of a term of endearment. Uh-huh. You get that impression that they loved going to that shop, perhaps after school or on Saturdays. So she had a wonderful rapport with the white community. Another gentleman from a prominent white family talks about in his book, remembering his life in Savannah, that she was a credit to her race, that yeah. She was welcomed by the white women of Savannah. So she was a very savvy businesswoman,
and she knew the power of relationships. There's a quote in the book that I liked where you said she, quote, used the power and influence of others to get what she wanted and needed. And that's key.
She did indeed. And she was very fortunate. We didn't mention one of the very restrictive laws that the legislators passed against free blacks was the guardianship law. If you were a free black person, so you didn't have a slave owner over you, but you still had to have a relationship with a white person that was a legally binding kind of relationship, and that person would oversee your business affairs. Aspasia chose for her guardian a John Elliott Ward, who was the mayor, one-term mayor of Savannah.
Wow.
So she knew how to pick them, and she had wonderful relationships with them.
And I'm assuming he was a white man.
Yes,
the mayor.
Guardians were only white.
They had to be
were
white.
all white.
Right. Mm-hmm. Interesting, very interesting. So, but in spite of losing the property, actually twice, the first time she to the city, and then to some gentleman named Swole, who bought it from the city, mm-hmm. and then he claimed that he owned it. What has happened to the Mirault family since then?
Well, in the book, I talk a little bit about the epilogue because they did lose the property, but I wanted to let everybody know that they did survive. They thrived. They did well, and her grandchildren had businesses and good jobs and careers, and they kept the unity of the family together and helped one another. So they were able to do well in the postbellum era.
So her legacy, in effect, did eventually come to pass because it has kind of gone full circle, and her great-grandchildren mm-hmm. now recognize the great role and contribution that she made to probably not only Savannah Black history, but as a result of her being a role model throughout Georgia and maybe even the nation. Who's not to know that Maggie Walker didn't hear about Aspasia and decided that she would, build her business too.
Yes.
So, Dr. Sumler-Edmond, thank you so much for joining us here at the Herndon home this evening.
It was so enjoyable. Thank you.
All right. Are we prepared to take some questions from the audience?
This is, I have 2 edited books, and this is my first book, I'm the sole author.
The Secret Trust. And just in case you didn't get the title, The Secret Trust of Aspasia Cruvellier Mirault, The Life and Trials of a Free Woman of Color in Antebellum, Georgia.
I have a chapter on the Betrayal. That was pretty shocking. That if you have a trust agreement over, let's say, 20 years, and all of a sudden, you're trusting someone to do right by your property, and then all of a sudden, that's just wiped away. The family was in shock that had happened. They felt he was a true friend and a confidant, and he betrayed them.
So why do you think he did betray them? Why did he claim it as his own after so many years, 20 plus years of, acknowledging that it did belong to Aspasia? What do you think happened that made him change his mind?
I wonder if something happened, perhaps in his personality or something. I know that all I could find out was that this was not the only litigation he was involved in. He was fighting with a lot of people in Savannah. There were a couple of other lawsuits ongoing. So he was a troubled soul, I'll put it that way. And so he's fighting with this one. He's trying to get money here. He's trying to get money there. And I guess he felt, this is a clear path. I've got title to it. I'm going to use it.
Right. Yeah.
And Aspasia is dead by that time. So he felt maybe I don't have the allegiance. I don't have allegiance to her children and grandchildren.
Just a number of African American families lost their properties during the Black Laws period as a result of those kinds of relationships.
Those kinds of relationships. That's why I was saying you can't sit on your rights. When you have a chance after the Civil War to make it right, to prove that this was really my mother's property, not this gentleman's property, you have to march into court with as much evidence as you can to make it formal.
Even if you did trust.
Even if you did
him.
trust, yes.
Right, or her, right. Yeah.
I have, in the book, I mention a couple of other cases, both in Augusta, which was also under that prohibition. You couldn't buy land in Augusta either. And these individuals did go into court after the Civil War. So they were able to retain their land. I do not think, I'm not aware of anything. The land, her house is gone, where she did build a house on Whitaker and Macon, the corner there. And it's a parking lot now. And I would love to see a little marker or something there. I'd love to work on something like that to get a mark. She deserves a marker. She was asking, were the Free Blacks, Spacey and her group and her generation, were they happy? And did they realize the mark that they were going to have? I think that they were happy. They had a wonderful religious life, social life, family life. They made their own reality. Despite the obstacles, they really were able to make lives for themselves in Savannah. And Savannah was a thriving place with lots of industry, lots of opportunities. Although there were many restrictions, the laws, but they
And didn't Savannah have the largest black population in the state?
I believe they did. I'm not for sure, but they had a sizable black population.
So it was a strong community.
Strong community. And knowing their place in history, I think maybe some of them did. I'm thinking about Andrew Bryan, who knew Aspasia and was an enslaved individual who will found the first African Baptist church. They had to understand what they were doing and the foundation that they were laying.
The other interesting thing about the Mirault family, too, was that not only could they read and write, but were they even able to speak and write French?
I suspect that they must have been able to, because they come over from Haiti, which I'm sure that they were bilingual.
Yeah. All right, in the back, one more question.
In terms from the black codes, we understand that black codes were a set of laws that control the behavior of most blacks, well, the enslaved at the time. So Christianity came in, and Christianity was allowed to progress in terms of from society's point of view. Was Christianity used as a tool for stabilizing, preventing revolts, and appeasing the population to the point where it became more controllable? Because that time you had a lot of revolts occurring at that time. What role exactly do you see Christianity playing in terms of mentoring or fomenting the society itself?
That's an excellent question, and actually, I just this semester I was sharing that issue. We were discussing that issue with my class at Huston-Tillotson University, and we were looking at Savannah, and we were contrasting the fact that Denmark Vesey in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1822, planned a massive slave revolt. And there were other, as you said, other plans for slave revolts in other cities. But Savannah didn't see that kind of, at least we're not aware of that kind of planning and plotting for of a slave revolt. And I've kind of come to the conclusion that the foundation of the black church as a solid institution, with Andrew Bryan, Andrew Marshall, the blacks who were Catholics, St. John the Baptist Catholic Church, and others. There were Episcopalians, other groups in Savannah. They may have provided such a stable foundation and an outlet that people were not that they didn't want more freedom and more rights, but they were comfortable enough that they did not plan a revolt like the Vesey revolt in South Carolina. So I think it did play a role in perhaps pacifying individuals to a certain extent.
Good question. Good question.
Excellent question.
Did I see one more hand back there? Okay. Well, can I turn it back over to you, Douglas?
I thank you very much
All right.
for your program and for joining us, Dr. Edmond and Ms. Jackson. And thank you, the audience, for your participation. Can we give you a round of applause?
Thank you.